watoto hapa ni makosa ya mada ya boma yangu, ya bwana yangu. Bwana yangu alikuwa alikuwa anataka kulala na watoto yake na ni yake anasa.
Imagine a place where survival is a daily battle, where overcrowding, disease, and violence are just part of life. Now, this is not some made-up horror story. This is the reality in some of the worst women's prisons in Africa. In these institutions, hope is a rare commodity, and even the strongest are pushed to their breaking point. But what's really happening behind those bars? And how do these women survive the unthinkable? Join us as we uncover the harsh realities of 10 of Africa's worst women's prisons. Number 10. Pollsmoor Prison. Pollsmoor Prison was built to hold just 3,000 inmates, but today it's crammed with more than 7,000 people. Imagine trying to fit twice as many people into a space as it was meant for. It's chaos. The overcrowding has pushed this place to its breaking point, turning it into one of the harshest and most dangerous prisons in South Africa. The women's section, in particular, is infamous for its appalling conditions. Cells that were originally designed for just a few prisoners are now stuffed with 2 or even 3 times the number they can handle. This kind of overcrowding creates a perfect storm for problems. Diseases spread like wildfire, especially with the lack of proper plumbing or sanitation. Many inmates suffer from skin infections, respiratory problems, and other illnesses simply because they're stuck in such filthy, cramped spaces. And it's not just physical health. Mental health takes a huge hit too. Then there's the violence. Every day in Pollsmoor is a battle for survival. Gangs rule the prison, fighting for power and control. Extortion, physical attacks, and sexual violence are part of life here. For women, the fear is constant. It's not just the gangs, they're also scared of other inmates who might be forced into violence or other crimes. The culture of fear runs so deep that many are too terrified to report abuse, which only makes things worse. Healthcare? It's almost non-existent. The medical facilities are overcrowded and underfunded, with too few doctors and nurses for the thousands of inmates who need help. Simple illnesses go untreated, and there have even been deaths that could have been prevented with basic care. It's heartbreaking and infuriating at the same time. Pollsmoor has also housed its share of notorious criminals, from gang leaders to high-profile political figures, adding even more tension to an already explosive environment. Over the years, human rights groups have called for major changes, but progress has been painfully slow. South Africa's financial struggles and limited resources mean that Pollsmoor remains trapped in a cycle of neglect and systemic failure. It's a place where survival feels like an uphill battle every single day, a stark reminder of how broken the system can be. As the horrors of overcrowding and mistreatment are a grim reality at Pollsmoor, another prison in Nairobi faces similar struggles. Number 9. Langata Women's Prison. Langata Women's Prison in Nairobi, Kenya, is a stark example of just how bad overcrowding can get in a correctional facility. Originally designed to house fewer than 300 inmates, it now crams in over 800 women, nearly 3 times its intended capacity. Imagine a cell meant for a handful of people, now packed with up to 80 women at once. There's barely any room to move, let alone any sense of privacy. With everyone squeezed together, prisoners often have no choice but to sleep on the hard floor in poorly ventilated and dimly lit spaces, creating an unbearably stifling atmosphere. Life in Langata isn't just tough, it's downright dehumanizing. Guards frequently resort to physical force to keep control, and verbal abuse is a daily ordeal. Women are subjected to degrading language that chips away at their dignity, and those who dare to speak out about the conditions often face harsh punishments. The psychological toll is devastating. Many inmates feel trapped, powerless to seek justice, and live in constant fear of retaliation. The basics for survival, clean water, proper sanitation, and healthcare, are in shockingly short supply. Medical staff are overwhelmed by the sheer number of inmates, and even getting treated for basic illnesses can be a challenge. Hunger is another grim reality. The food provided is meager and poorly prepared, lacking the nutrients necessary to stay healthy. Many women are left malnourished, their immune systems weakened, making them more vulnerable to diseases. In some cases, inmates have reported going without food entirely, an unimaginable situation in such harsh conditions. While the Kenyan government has made some attempts to address the issues at Langata, progress has been painfully slow. The gap between what needs to be done and what is actually happening remains massive. Non-governmental organizations and human rights advocates continue to highlight the appalling conditions, but without significant reforms, the women in Langata remain trapped in a cycle of suffering and neglect. Langata might illustrate the extreme consequences of overcrowding and mistreatment, but the situation in this prison in South Sudan prison paints an even darker picture of systemic abuse. Number 8. Juba Central Women's Prison. In the heart of South Sudan's bustling capital lies a prison that tells a heartbreaking story of hardship, injustice, and neglect. Juba Central Prison, built decades ago to hold just 500 inmates, now crams in over 2,000. The result? A place so overcrowded, it's not just uncomfortable, it's downright unbearable. Picture this: tiny cells meant for 10 people now holding up to 70 women. The air feels suffocating, the conditions degrading, and the struggle for basic survival relentless. This extreme overcrowding is more than a numbers problem, it's a human tragedy. Hygiene is almost non-existent, with barely any clean water and a shocking shortage of toilets. Diseases spread like wildfire. Inmates battle infections and illnesses daily, yet medical care is practically a myth. Piles of waste go untreated, turning the prison into a ticking health bomb. It's a place where surviving each day feels like a small miracle. But the nightmare doesn't stop at physical suffering. Mentally, the women endure horrors no one should face. Reports of torture, physical abuse, and relentless cruelty from prison authorities paint a grim picture. Fear hangs in the air, leaving inmates stripped of dignity and hope. Then there's the gnawing pain of hunger. The prison barely manages to provide food, and what little there is offers no real nutrition. Malnutrition is rampant, and for many, chronic health problems are the norm. The saddest part? Some of these women are mothers, and their children are trapped in this hell with them. These kids, innocent of any crime, grow up surrounded by filth, disease, and despair. No proper food, no education, no chance at a better life. They're being robbed of their childhoods and futures. The problems don't end when the prison gates open. Corruption, mismanagement, and underfunding plague South Sudan's entire justice system, and rehabilitation programs are practically unheard of. Women who manage to leave the prison often face harsh judgment and rejection from society, making it nearly impossible to rebuild their lives. Juba Central Prison isn't just a crumbling building. It's a symbol of a system in desperate need of change. Overcrowding, filth, and inhumane treatment must be addressed immediately. Everyone deserves the basics: clean water, food, medical care, and safety. Women need protection and support, not punishment and abuse. And above all, South Sudan needs to invest in real rehabilitation, giving these women and their children a fighting chance at a better tomorrow. But Juba's dire conditions pale in comparison to this other prison in the Democratic Republic of Congo, painting an even bleaker picture. Number 7. Makala Central Prison. Makala Central Prison in Kinshasa, the bustling capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo, is a heartbreaking example of the country's failing prison system. Built during the Belgian colonial rule in the 1950s, it was designed to hold just 1,500 inmates. But today, it's bursting at the seams, housing over 15,000 prisoners in crumbling conditions. This extreme overcrowding makes Makala one of the most packed prisons in all of Africa and paints a grim picture of the challenges plaguing Congo's justice system. Life inside Makala is nothing short of a nightmare, especially for women. The female wing is so overcrowded that dozens are packed into cells meant for just a few. There's no room to lie down, so inmates often take turns sleeping or are forced to curl up on the cold, hard floor. Privacy is unheard of, and fights over the most basic necessities happen all the time. Hygiene is another serious issue. Clean water, soap, and sanitary products are scarce. Toilets are either broken or completely unusable, turning the prison into a breeding ground for diseases like cholera. Medical care is practically non-existent. One nurse might be assigned to hundreds of prisoners, and medication is rarely available. For pregnant women and mothers with babies, the situation is even more desperate, as they rarely get the care they need. The world's attention turned to Makala in September 2024 when a terrifying tragedy unfolded. During an attempted prison break, armed attackers stormed the facility and chaos erupted. The female wing was breached, leading to an unspeakable night of violence. More than 260 women were sexually assaulted, and at least 129 people lost their lives. Some were killed in the violence, while others were trampled in the panicked rush to escape. Survivors were left with deep physical and emotional scars, but the help they desperately needed, mental health support, medical care, or legal assistance, was nearly impossible to find. Even worse, many of the attackers walked away without facing any consequences. Corruption and a broken investigative system meant justice was out of reach for most victims. Human rights organizations and governments worldwide condemned the incident, demanding urgent reforms. Groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch released damning reports calling for immediate action to reduce overcrowding, boost security, and provide basic health care. But despite the outrage and calls for change, progress has been painfully slow. Corruption, political instability, and a lack of funding keep meaningful improvements out of reach, leaving Makala and its inmates trapped in a cycle of neglect and suffering. As the world looks at the heart-wrenching conditions of Makala Central Prison, another equally disturbing prison story unfolds across Africa. Number 6. Al-Qanater Prison. Behind the towering iron bars of Al-Qanater Prison, there's a heartbreaking world that most people never see. This isn't just Egypt's largest women's prison, it's a harsh reminder of the struggles many women face when they're forgotten by society. Sitting on the outskirts of Cairo, Al-Qanater was built in the early 1990s to house around 500 inmates. But today, it often holds more than double that number, cramming over 1,000 women into spaces never meant to handle such a crowd. The overcrowding has turned this place into a daily battle for survival. The cells are tiny, stuffy, and lack proper ventilation. There's no real sanitation, so the women are forced to live in conditions that are not only filthy, but dangerous to their health. Imagine being stuck in a space with no fresh air or sunlight, day after day. It's no wonder despair hangs heavy in the air. One of the most shocking realities is the lack of proper toilets. Instead, inmates rely on buckets, which fill the prison with unbearable smells. It's not just humiliating, it's a health hazard, and for women, it gets worse. There's a constant shortage of menstrual hygiene products, leaving them to make do with scraps of cloth or whatever they can find. This isn't just uncomfortable, it's deeply degrading and adds to their emotional suffering. Family visits, limited to just 10 or 15 minutes every 2 weeks, barely scratch the surface of their need for connection. Many women feel completely abandoned, cut off from the outside world, and with no education or rehabilitation programs in place, life in Al-Qanater is a bleak, repetitive cycle of hardship, offering no hope for a better future. Healthcare and nutrition are almost non-existent. Meals are so meager and lacking in nutrients that malnutrition is widespread. Medical care is equally scarce, and illnesses that would be easy to treat elsewhere are often ignored, leaving women to suffer in silence. Human rights groups have been calling attention to these dire conditions for years. Reports of abuse, neglect, and dehumanization paint a grim picture of life inside Al-Qanater. For the women trapped there, hope feels like a distant dream, overshadowed by a reality that's almost too harsh to imagine. The grim conditions at Al-Qanater expose the harsh realities faced by incarcerated women in Egypt. But a similarly haunting narrative unfolds thousands of miles away in Madagascar. Now, it's time for today's subscriber pick. Deep in the heart of a small, dusty village in East Africa sat Kungo prison, a place that sent shivers down the spines of even the bravest souls. It wasn't just a prison, it was a world of its own, overcrowded and filled with chaos. With over 10,000 women locked up behind its rusty gates, it was the largest and most feared women's prison in all of Africa. Inside, life was a constant fight for survival. Food was scarce, guards were ruthless, and the warden ruled with an iron fist. But amid the despair, 6 women dared to dream of something better. They called themselves the 6 Rebels. Every night, while the prison slept, the women huddled together in the dark corners of their overcrowded cell. They whispered plans of resistance, ways to fight back against the corruption and cruelty that plagued Kungo. They smuggled food to the starving, protected the weak, and quietly exposed the guards' darkest secrets. Their acts of kindness didn't go unnoticed. To the other inmates, they were heroes, but to the warden and her corrupt guards, they were trouble, a spark that could set the whole place ablaze. One fateful morning, the warden decided enough was enough. The guards stormed into the cell block like wolves on a hunt, dragging the 6 women out of their beds. They were accused of crimes they didn't commit, stealing from the guards' quarters, planning an escape, and even attacking an officer. The charges were lies, but in Kungo, lies carried more weight than truth. Words spread like wildfire through the prison. Inmates banged on their cell bars, shouting and pleading for mercy, but the guards were deaf to their cries. The 6 rebels were led to the gallows, their hands tied and faces grim. They didn't beg. They didn't cry. They stood tall, their courage shining brighter than the setting sun. As the ropes tightened around their necks, the group's leader, Amina, turned to the crowd of inmates watching from behind the bars. Her voice, though weak, carried a strength that silenced the chaos. "Don't stop fighting," she said. "The truth doesn't die with us." And then it was over. Could these women's courage be the beginning of a revolution? Let us have your opinions in the comment below. Number 5. Antanimora Prison. In the lively and bustling city of Antananarivo, Madagascar's capital, lies Antanimora Prison, a place that paints a grim picture of the country's struggling justice system. Built to house only 800 inmates, it now crams in over 4,000, turning every inch of space into a battleground for survival. Imagine having so little room that people are forced to sleep practically on top of each other, with legs and feet pressing awkwardly against their neighbors' faces. Rest for many becomes an exhausting challenge rather than a moment of relief. The overcrowding isn't just a numbers problem, it's driven by the fact that about 60% of the inmates are pre-trial detainees. These are individuals who haven't even been convicted of a crime yet, stuck waiting for their day in court. But the hardships don't end there. Living conditions inside the prison are downright shocking. Hygiene is almost non-existent, and nutrition is a daily battle. Inmates are fed just once a day, usually a meager serving of boiled cassava, leaving many malnourished. For women, the situation is even worse, with nearly 40% suffering from chronic undernourishment. Unsurprisingly, such poor conditions create the perfect storm for disease outbreaks. With little access to proper medical care, illnesses spread like wildfire. This became glaringly clear during the COVID-19 pandemic, when the cramped, unsanitary environment made stopping the virus nearly impossible. In 2019, President Andry Rajoelina visited Antanimora Prison, openly acknowledging its terrible state and the need for urgent reforms. Promises were made, plans to expand the prison's budget and tackle overcrowding began to take shape. But meaningful change has been painfully slow. The lack of resources extends beyond space and food. There are no proper rehabilitation or educational programs to help inmates rebuild their lives. Once released, many find themselves trapped in the same cycle of poverty and crime that brought them there in the first place. Organizations like Amnesty International have repeatedly called for Madagascar's government to prioritize reducing pre-trial detentions and protecting prisoners' basic rights. Yet, progress is sluggish, and the road ahead is steep. Still, activists and the global community hold on to hope, believing that ongoing advocacy and political will can eventually bring about the change that Antanimora's prisoners desperately need. Until then, the prison remains a stark reminder of the challenges facing Madagascar's justice system. While Antanimora Prison struggles with overcrowding and inadequate living conditions, another prison in Zimbabwe faces even much tougher horrors. Number 4. Chikurubi Women's Prison. This prison is often described as a waking nightmare for the women trapped inside its walls. The conditions are beyond terrible, some might say inhumane. Imagine cramming 25 women into a single cell that's just 30 feet long and 13 feet wide, a space that could barely hold half that number. The overcrowding isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. Fights break out regularly, diseases spread like wildfire, and the air is so stifling it feels like you're suffocating. With no proper ventilation, the heat becomes unbearable, making survival an everyday challenge. Sanitation is practically absent. The toilets overflow because the drainage systems are either broken or don't work at all, leaving the place reeking and filthy. There's hardly any clean water, so inmates are forced to drink and wash with contaminated water. This leads to constant outbreaks of cholera, dysentery, and other waterborne illnesses. Even basic hygiene products, like disinfectants, are scarce. Many of the sinks and buckets meant for cleaning are either broken or simply not there. Healthcare is just as grim. The prison has next to no medicine, medical equipment, or staff. Women with chronic illnesses like diabetes or HIV/AIDS often go without treatment, their conditions worsening by the day. In some heartbreaking cases, those with life-threatening illnesses are simply left to fend for themselves, as though their lives don't matter. It's no wonder human rights groups have slammed these conditions, calling them an outright violation of human dignity. The food situation is equally appalling. What little is provided is often spoiled, barely edible, and nowhere near enough to meet daily nutritional needs. Many inmates rely on food brought by family or sponsors, but even that help is bogged down by endless red tape. Complaints from prisoners about food and living conditions are common, but meaningful change remains a distant dream. Chikurubi Women's Prison isn't just infamous in Zimbabwe, it's notorious worldwide. Human rights organizations have repeatedly urged the government to step in and fix this disaster, but real progress has been frustratingly slow. For the women stuck here, each day is a battle against hunger, sickness, and despair. It's a system that seems more focused on breaking their spirits than helping them rehabilitate. While Chikurubi Women's Prison exposes the crushing weight of neglect and systemic failures in Zimbabwe, another prison in Zambia takes the horror a step further. Number 3. Kabwe Women's Prison. Kabwe Women's Prison in Zambia, also known as Mukobeko Maximum Correctional Facility, is infamous for its heartbreaking conditions and the shocking treatment of its female inmates. It's a place that lays bare the failures of Zambia's justice system, especially when it comes to protecting the basic human rights of women. Life here is nothing short of a daily fight to survive. Food is a constant struggle. The meals are barely enough to keep anyone going. Small portions that lack the nutrients prisoners desperately need. Many women live in a state of constant hunger, which weakens their bodies and makes them more vulnerable to illnesses. Speaking of illnesses, diseases like tuberculosis and cholera spread like wildfire, thanks to filthy conditions, no proper sanitation, and a severe shortage of clean water. Then there's the overcrowding. Imagine a cell meant for 4 people, now crammed with 10, sometimes even 15 women. It's suffocating. Privacy? Forget it. Beds or mats to sleep on? Rare. It's a space where people are forced to live on top of each other, making it nearly impossible to avoid catching something contagious. For women, the nightmare doesn't end there. Reports of abuse are disturbingly common. Physical violence, torture, and even sexual assault by guards happen far too often. And the worst part, most victims suffer in silence because speaking up either gets them ignored or puts them in even more danger. Medical care for survivors, virtually non-existent. And if the overcrowding, hunger, and abuse weren't enough, the prison is also overrun with rats. These rodents are everywhere, contaminating food, spreading more diseases, and even attacking women while they sleep. It's a horrifying reality that underscores just how bad the sanitation and pest control are in the facility. You'd think a prison might offer programs to help inmates turn their lives around, but Kabwe offers next to nothing. There are hardly any educational or vocational programs to give these women a fighting chance at rebuilding their lives after they leave. Instead, they're trapped in a cycle of poverty and hopelessness, with no tools to break free. At its core, Kabwe Women's Prison is a glaring pointer to a broken system that desperately needs change. Interestingly, the situation in neighboring prisons in Uganda reveals even darker realities. Number 2. Luzira Women's Prison. Luzira Women's Prison in Kampala, Uganda, has earned a grim reputation for its harsh and inhumane conditions. Originally designed to house about 1,700 women, the prison now crams in over 8,000 inmates, a staggering and heartbreaking reality. This extreme overcrowding has turned the facility into a suffocating, dangerous space where survival feels like a daily battle. Worse still, reports of abuse, both physical and psychological, paint a bleak picture of life inside. Violence is a constant threat, coming not just from fellow inmates, but sometimes even from the guards, creating an environment filled with fear and tension. The overcrowding alone is a disaster. Imagine hundreds of women packed into cells meant for far fewer, with barely any space to sit or lie down. Poor ventilation makes the air suffocating, and sanitation is practically non-existent. These conditions create a perfect breeding ground for diseases like tuberculosis, which spreads rapidly. Medical care, almost non-existent. Many women are left to suffer from illnesses that could easily be treated if only the resources were available. Food is another major issue. Inmates are given meager portions of low-quality food, leaving many malnourished. Their weakened immune systems make them even more vulnerable to disease outbreaks. It's not just about the hunger, it's the ripple effect on their health and overall well-being. Hygiene is a nightmare. With such severe overcrowding, there's no room for privacy, and sanitary facilities are shockingly inadequate. Epidemics are a constant threat, and the lack of basic cleanliness adds to the daily misery. What makes it all even more heartbreaking is that many of the women imprisoned here are not hardened criminals. Many are behind bars for minor offenses, often tied to poverty or systemic inequality. Instead of getting help or rehabilitation, they're thrown into this cruel environment where their dignity and hope are stripped away. For these women, Luzira isn't just a prison. It's a place of despair, where their basic human rights are ignored. They're stuck in a cycle of neglect and suffering, with little chance of escape or improvement. Much like Luzira Women's Prison, another prison in Sudan reveals the devastating effects of overcrowding and systemic neglect. Number 1. Omdurman Prison. Omdurman Women's Prison, tucked away in the city of Omdurman, Sudan, is one of the most infamous prisons in the country, and for all the wrong reasons. Its chilling reputation stretches back to the days of British colonial rule in the early 1900s. Back then, it was built to house a mere 500 inmates, but today, it's crammed with over 2,000 women. This shocking overcrowding mirrors the widespread neglect in Sudan's crumbling prison system. Imagine cells originally meant for 10 women, now suffocating with as many as 70. The floors become beds, clean water is almost a luxury, and food is never enough. Hygiene is a disaster, with illnesses like tuberculosis and skin infections spreading like wildfire. There's little to no medical care, leaving inmates to suffer in silence. Life here is not just tough, it's unbearable. What's worse, many of the women here aren't hardened criminals. Some have been locked up for minor offenses, like wearing clothes deemed too modern, speaking out against the government, or even participating in peaceful protests. These so-called crimes are often just a reflection of Sudan's deeply rooted gender inequality. Many are detained without trial, often based on flimsy accusations or no evidence at all. But that's not the end of their nightmare. Inside the prison, the abuse is relentless. Female inmates are frequently subjected to verbal, physical, and even sexual harassment by guards. Arbitrary beatings, solitary confinement, and degrading punishments are horrifyingly common. It's a life filled with trauma, with little hope for justice. Omdurman Women's Prison is more than just a prison. It's a grim reminder of Sudan's broader problems. The country ranks dismally on global gender equality scales. Women face harsher laws, fewer rights, and little protection under a male-dominated system. Calls for change from human rights groups and organizations like Amnesty International have been loud and persistent. They demand better living conditions, fair trials, and the release of political prisoners. Yet the Sudanese authorities have largely turned a blind eye. This place isn't just a prison. It's the epitome of a broken system. And until real reforms take root, the women inside its walls will continue to endure unimaginable suffering. What are your thoughts about the worst women's prisons in Africa? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section below.